Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, here to help you fall asleep with these chilling horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so feel free to leave a comment. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. It all started. When I was a kid, more precisely a young teenager, I spent many Saturday evenings babysitting my two younger siblings. As the eldest of three, it was simply expected that I take on this responsibility without any extra pay or special thanks. It was just my contribution to keeping the family together. I babysat so often because my parents really needed the break. They'd had their share of marital troubles, and their counselor had urged them to go on weekly date nights, to rekindle the magic, to bring back that spark. Sure, it was annoying to lose an evening of my own plans, but it wasn't a huge burden when I saw that my parents were happier than they'd been in years, eagerly anticipating their nights out. I would have preferred to be out with my friends, yet I remembered all too well what had happened when my aunt and uncle's marriage fell apart after a bitter divorce. I desperately wanted my parents to stay together. On the evening of December 3rd, 2006, I found myself standing at the open front door of our isolated, weather-beaten house on the outskirts of a small town in upstate New York. I waved goodbye as my parents drove off along the icy driveway in their beat-up sedan. "Drive safe," I called out, watching my breath cloud in the freezing air. I couldn't be sure if they heard me over the rumble of the engine. With my arms wrapped around myself against the biting cold, I exhaled deeply, letting my breath fade into the night. Outside, there wasn't another car in sight, nor any living creature stirring. It wasn't long before I grew bored and went back inside, my nose tingling from the chill. Inside, my younger brother Jake and little sister Katie were having dinner at our kitchen table. Jake, 3 years younger than me, was severely autistic and rarely spoke except to ask for something in his own clipped phrases. Milk and bread was our code for the peanut butter and jelly sandwich he was hungrily devouring. Katie, barely 2 years old, was a bundle of giggles and coos. The almost 9-year gap between Jake and Katie was obvious, yet my parents always insisted that Katie was a cherished, planned blessing, just as I once swore I didn't know how those magazines ended up under my mattress back in elementary school. But I digress. After dinner, I set about our nightly routine. Jake retreated to his room with our prized PlayStation 2, a hot commodity in our neighborhood, while Katie settled into her crib in front of Sesame Street on the small TV. I then headed to the basement to light the old cast-iron fireplace, dimmed the overhead lights, and curled up with a book under the soft glow of our Christmas tree's twinkling lights. God, what a beautiful house it was. Not a day passed that I didn't miss that warmth and comfort. I read contentedly for nearly an hour until night had fully settled in, and the basement had grown pleasantly warm. I began to nod off when I suddenly heard heavy, determined footsteps descending the stairs. It was Jake, shuffling into the room. I sat up straight, expecting him to say something. "No more knocking," he mumbled. His little forehead creased in irritation. I shook my head in confusion. "I'm not knocking, Jake. Is someone at the door?" He just stared at me blankly. "Jake," I said more firmly, "did someone knock at the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "It was at the window." Knocking at the window? I immediately stood up, now completely alert. "Jake, is someone knocking at your window?" "Not anymore," he replied simply. I stood there for a moment, uncertain of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank on me, I thought, but being alone in such a big house made my nerves flutter. My mind raced. I was a 13-year-old boy in a decent house on a quiet, tree-lined suburban street in upstate New York. There were hardly any houses for miles around. The street was nearly empty, and the nearest police station was at least 10 minutes away. It was likely just one of the kids messing with me, but What if it wasn't? "Follow me," I whispered to Jake. My hand trembled as I turned to the front door's knob and looked up the stairs. At the top, it was dark, the only light coming from Katie's room. Katie! I raced up the stairs to her room, where she sat happily in her crib, giggling as her favorite plush toy bounced in her arms. I exhaled in relief, though my heart still pounded. This was ridiculous, I told myself. I needed to be brave. I then made my way down the hall towards Jake's room, hesitating before the closed door. Taking a deep breath, I cracked it open just enough to reach for the light switch, then paused. If this turned out to be the worst-case scenario, I didn't want our mysterious visitor to know exactly where I was in the house. The only light in the room came from the paused screen of the video game running on his PlayStation 2. I listened carefully for any sounds but heard nothing. Soon, I began to suspect that perhaps Jake had imagined the knocking. Feeling a bit annoyed, I moved over to the window and pulled up the blinds. Outside was a quiet scene, a landscape blanketed with fresh snow and an empty, silent street beyond. I felt a small measure of relief watching the large, soft snowflakes drift gently to the ground. But then I noticed something, a set of footprints pressed into the fresh snow right beneath the window. At first, I couldn't make sense of them. I stared, transfixed by the deep impressions. Shoes, clearly a man's, with a style none of my friends would ever wear. I followed the prints backward from the window to the sidewalk, trying to trace where this intruder might have come from. But where did they lead? The night was clear, and the moon shone proudly among the drifting clouds. I watched as the footprints crossed our front yard, only to disappear behind a massive pine tree. My heart hammered in my chest. Whoever had run behind that tree was still out there. In a surge of panic, I quickly pulled away from the window. Jake, sensing my fear, began to whimper softly. No, shh, I murmured, desperate to calm him. I turned off the television and led Jake out of his room. I then hurried over to Katie's room, switched off her little TV, and scooped her up as we moved silently down the stairs. Nothing to see, Jake whispered, though Katie soon began to cry. I whistled gently to quiet her as we descended. Once in the basement, I unplugged the string of colorful Christmas lights so that the only illumination came from the low-burning fire in the old stove. I placed Jake carefully on the worn couch and let Katie settle into his arms. "Sit right here," I instructed him, locking my gaze on his frightened eyes. "Don't move, understand? Stay very still." I knew I had to call the police. I wanted to alert my parents too, but in 2006 they still relied on our old landline, and tonight it felt like every call might go unanswered. I crept upstairs as quietly as possible and reached for the telephone hanging in the living room. I picked up the receiver and dialed 911, but all I got was an eerie silence. I hung up and tried again, nothing. That's when the tears began. I couldn't stop them. I was terrified. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that maybe it was just a technical glitch, though nothing suggested a power outage. The snow fell steadily outside and there wasn't even a hint of wind. Nothing that could have knocked our phone out. Reluctantly, I returned to Katie's room and peered out the window again. My eyes first went to the pine tree where the footprints had ended, but now they continued beyond it. At some point, while I was shepherding my siblings downstairs, the shadow that had lingered behind the tree had moved on. I followed the fresh tracks across our frozen front yard until I saw a man standing at the far edge of the driveway. He was staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, heart pounding. This was no friend or neighborhood kid. I had never seen this man before. He stood there in a black turtleneck and matching trousers, a dark silhouette against the pure white snow. I couldn't take my eyes off him, and he never broke the unyielding stare. We stood in that silent, frozen moment for what felt like an eternity. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst, and a wave of nausea washed over me. For the first time, as I stared into that hollow gaze, I seriously considered that I might not make it through the night. I remembered a story about my father's cousin who died in a freak accident at the age of 11, forever frozen in time, a permanent reminder of youth lost. Tears blurred my vision once again. "Please, don't hurt us," I pleaded in a trembling voice. I knew he couldn't really hear me, but I had to try. At last, the man broke our eye contact and looked up at the sky as the gentle snow continued to fall. I couldn't quite catch his words, but I watched, transfixed, as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small handful of dark, powdery substance. Still gazing upward and murmuring to himself, he tossed the powder onto the snow at his feet. I wanted nothing more than to run and fetch my siblings, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the bizarre scene unfolding before me. The house was still locked, and I clung to the hope that I had some control over the situation. I couldn't help but watch, even as dread filled me. Then the man casually removed his turtleneck and tossed it aside onto the snow. He stopped looking at the sky, yet his lips continued to move in a low, almost rhythmic chant. I focused desperately on his mouth, straining to make out his words, when I suddenly caught sight of a glint in the moonlight. A knife. A long, cold blade emerged from his other pocket, already smeared with dark stains. Stains of what? I couldn't be sure. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream as I watched him slowly drag the knife along his pale, swollen abdomen. A thin red line began to form along his stomach, and deep crimson blood started to drip steadily from the wound. The blood streamed down, pooling onto the black powder scattered on the ground. Then, with a twisted smile, the man looked up at the sky again. His face contorted into a grotesque, almost euphoric expression as he began to sob uncontrollably, snot dribbling from his nostrils, even as his eyes shone with a deranged joy. My stomach churned in disgust and fear. This man was clearly in a state of delirium. I stood there, almost mesmerized by the macabre spectacle, when suddenly his face snapped back to me. His eyes went wild and uncontrolled. Still clutching the knife, he broke into a sprint directly toward our window. I caught sight of the glinting blade and, acting on pure instinct, bolted from the room. I slammed the door behind me and raced down the stairs as I heard the sound of shattering glass. The man screamed in agony as I reached the basement, where I quickly locked the door and ran to where Jake and Katie were hiding. "Stop screaming," Jake whimpered. "No more screaming," I murmured, softly stroking his hair to calm him down, while Katie, for reasons I couldn't explain, seemed almost unbothered, as if in a daze. My heart pounded as I listened intently. Was he inside the house? A desperate, naive hope whispered that maybe he'd hurt himself on the broken glass, or that his self-inflicted wound had slowed him down. But then I heard it. The subtle, unmistakable sound of footsteps ascending the stairs. He was in the house, and after that sound, he deliberately tried to move as quietly as possible. I quickly gathered Jake and Katie and led them into a cramped storage room off the basement, careful to close the door with as little noise as possible. We huddled there for what felt like an eternity, about 5 long minutes, listening to the creaks and groans of the old wooden beams above us. Then it hit me. I'm not sure why it took so long. We weren't completely trapped. There was still an escape route. In my mind's eye, I saw the narrow bathroom window at the far end of the hall, the only link between our basement and the outside world. Almost as if in perfect timing, a frustrated shout from above was followed by a tremendous crash. He had knocked something over, perhaps the living room furniture or even the kitchen cabinet. "He's here!" the man screamed hysterically. "How dare you hide from me?" I still don't know whom he meant by he, but at that moment, as I heard him begin descending the stairs again, I knew I had to act. Clutching Katie in one arm and gently guiding Jake with the other, I crept down the hall toward the bathroom. There, I fixed my eyes on the narrow window high on the wall. It was a tight squeeze, but I was determined we could make it. I flung the window open, climbed onto the toilet to gain some height, and carefully placed Katie onto the narrow ledge. Then I scrambled down and turned to Jake. "Get on the toilet now," I ordered harshly, my voice cracking with urgency. "Gross, I don't want to be on the toilet," he protested, looking mortified. I could hear the sound of the man fiddling with the doorknob at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but it was the only way to force Jake's cooperation. I grabbed him roughly by the collar and smacked his cheek. "Jake, get your damn self on the toilet," I growled. He burst into tears from both pain and shock, but eventually he clambered onto the toilet. "Climb out the window," I barked, and as he clung desperately to the windowsill, I mustered all my strength to help push him upward. He nearly slipped back down, just barely, but to my astonishment, he managed to pull himself up. Together, we squeezed through the narrow bathroom window into the frigid night, with snow swirling chaotically around us. I gently lifted Katie and helped Jake fully exit. Without daring to look back, we ran along the snowy path until our house was nothing more than a dark silhouette behind us. In the distance, I could still hear the ragged breathing of the man as he searched desperately inside our home, but we were long gone. When we finally reached the safety of a neighbor's farmhouse, its porch light a beacon in the darkness, I nearly collapsed with relief. Within minutes, the police arrived, having been alerted by our desperate cries earlier. The man was eventually apprehended, but the terror and vivid memories of that night remain seared into my mind to this very day. When I was 6 years old, my parents decided to sell our house in Savannah, Georgia, so that we could move back to Atlanta. They agreed that my mother and I would temporarily stay with my grandmother in a small town near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, while my father remained behind in Savannah for a while. My grandmother lived in an idyllic town called Maplewood, a place where I had spent many happy summers. The house she owned was a charming relic from another era. Its exterior was striking. A meticulously kept lawn stretched around a stately wooden structure built in the traditional timber frame style, painted in a deep forest green that perfectly blended with the surrounding countryside. Inside, the furniture told stories of generations. Many pieces had been passed down through the family, though a few had been replaced over time due to wear. Most were antique relics with a faded green patina. Together with the rich red carpet that lined the main hall, the furniture gave the home a cozy, almost festive atmosphere reminiscent of a long-ago Christmas. There was one quirk, though. The entire house always carried the unmistakable scent of smoke. My grandmother was hopelessly addicted to cigars, and in every room you could spot a few ashtrays perched atop the old furniture and scattered on the carpet. This constant haze of tobacco smoke lent the house an even older, mysterious air. All of us slept on the ground floor, while the upstairs was mostly relegated to storage. My grandmother's health had been on the decline for some time, and climbing the stairs had become too strenuous for her. A tired widow who had been married 3 times, she had once had no trouble managing the stairs when she was young and raising her 7 children, each of whom needed a place to sleep. The upper level, as spacious as the main floor, boasted several rooms decorated with neat, tasteful furniture and classic portraits. I remember the first time I ventured upstairs, I only made it as far as the long corridor before turning back. My mother was downstairs with my grandmother, and I, curious as ever, began to explore the house on my own. As soon as I climbed the stairs, an unsettling feeling took hold of me. Even now, I cannot quite explain it, but something deep inside whispered that I shouldn't go further. Once I reached the top, I just stood there, paralyzed by the intensity of that foreboding presence. The corridor exuded an almost malignant atmosphere. My heart pounded wildly, and after a few tentative steps down the hall, I spun around and dashed back to the living room where everyone was chatting. The feeling was simply overwhelming. Later that evening, I confided in my mother that the upstairs felt frightening. She chuckled and admitted that she too had always been uneasy about that area, secretly believing it was haunted. We laughed about it, and soon my mind drifted to happier thoughts as I eventually fell asleep. The following weekend, my father came to visit. Seizing the opportunity, my grandmother asked him to go upstairs and retrieve some old boxes that hadn't been unpacked in over a decade. He told her he would get them after lunch. Hearing this, I began to panic. At the lunch table, I told my father that I was sure something supernatural haunted the upper floor and begged him not to go. Smiling, he reassured me that there was nothing to fear and insisted that he'd go up with me by his side. Reluctantly, I agreed, convincing myself that if anything did happen, my dad would be there to protect me. That afternoon, we ascended the stairs together. As he fetched the boxes, I clung to his side, and to my relief, nothing bizarre occurred. The strange sensation faded away, and I realized I'd been nothing more than an anxious little boy, scared simply of being alone. Once we had brought the boxes downstairs, we began unpacking them. I felt a twinge of embarrassment, knowing that there was absolutely nothing to be frightened of, a mere overactive imagination on my part. Among the contents of the boxes were old family photographs, and for the first time, I saw pictures of my grandfather. My mother had been only 6 when he passed away, and I couldn't fathom the depth of her loss, especially since I was roughly her age at the time. The photos were filled with images of joyous family gatherings. From birthday parties to high school graduations, every milestone was captured. Then I came across one portrait that struck me as odd. It was a much larger image than any I'd seen before, an early family portrait that seemed to date back to the late 1800s. The picture had a faded, almost eerie quality, as if it belonged to another time entirely. It depicted a family, a mother and father standing behind their 5 children, all posed in a somber, stiff manner. The father loomed far larger than the rest, almost ominously so. Although the overall tone of the portrait was dark, I noticed that every family member was dressed in similarly dark clothing, almost as if they'd just come from a funeral. Their expressions were stern, even angry. But what unsettled me most was that every person in the portrait had completely white eyes, as white as freshly printed paper. The uncanny sight sent a chill down my spine. While my parents were still rummaging through other boxes, I turned to my mother and showed her the portrait. Her smile faded, replaced by a deep frown and a look of apprehension. She didn't recognize the painting, and my father even seemed visibly disturbed, a rarity since nothing usually rattled him. We carried the portrait into another room where my grandmother sat, puffing on a cigar. She took the portrait from my mother and stared at it for several long minutes before my mother asked if she knew who the people in the picture were. With a dismissive shake of her head, my grandmother set the portrait down on the table, lit another cigar with a kind of intensity I'd never seen before, and said she couldn't place the faces at all. For the rest of that weekend, my mother and I maintained a running joke about the creepy portrait, referring to the family as the ancestors. I eagerly joined in the banter, and we laughed together, with my mother teasing that the portrait was cursed and that lingering near it too long might even bring on a deadly illness. Her dark humor, even in jest, left a lingering shiver in the back of my mind. In the week that followed, while my father returned to Savannah and my mother and I stayed at Maplewood, I found solace in drawing stick figures. I filled page after page with heroic action scenes and epic battles between good and evil, using up every scrap of paper we had until I was forced to search every surface for a new canvas. One afternoon, while my mother was out grocery shopping and my grandmother busied herself in the kitchen, I found myself alone in the living room with nothing to do. Searching for something to draw on, my eyes landed on that strange old portrait, now sitting exactly where my grandmother had placed it over the weekend. Inspiration struck. I flipped the portrait over, revealing a pristine white backside that begged to be used as my canvas. I quickly sketched 2 stick figures, one shooting at the other, with jagged lines for bullets that struck the other figure right on the head. I laughed at my own mischief, not fully understanding why I felt compelled to alter the image. To me, it was just another moment of childish creativity. Once finished, I flipped the portrait back to its original front side, placed it gently back where I'd found it, and sat down without a second thought. Time passed, and soon my 7th birthday arrived, bringing with it new coloring books and toys. The day after, I was allowed to go swimming, and upon returning home, I played in the backyard while my mother and grandmother chatted. But boredom eventually drew me indoors once more. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a strange compulsion to venture up to the 2nd floor, a challenge to prove to myself that I could conquer the fear that had plagued me before. I recalled that my father had once fearlessly climbed those stairs on his own. Determined not to be labeled a coward, I crept quietly up the stairs and into the long corridor. But as soon as I stepped onto the upper level, I stopped dead in my tracks. The same oppressive, sinister presence that had once warned me off returned, now even more intense. My heart pounded, my palms grew clammy, and I felt as though an invisible weight pressed down on me. I wanted nothing more than to turn back and flee, yet a stubborn part of me refused to admit fear. I wanted to be a big boy, craving an adventure. For 5 long minutes I hesitated at the end of the hallway. At the far end stood a closed door directly opposite me. Somehow, though I was scared, I convinced myself that I could make it. Just 5 minutes in that room, I told myself repeatedly. I crept forward slowly, each step laden with trepidation until I reached the door. Then I heard it. A creaking sound, like a baby's crib being rocked back and forth. I edged closer and pressed my ear against the door. At that moment, the floor creaked under my foot and the creaking sound abruptly stopped. I froze, unable to move or breathe, paralyzed with fear. Wait, I thought. I'm a big boy, not a coward. I can do this. Summoning what little courage I had, I wiped the sweat from my brow and slowly opened the door. Inside, the room was arranged as if for a small child. Baby blue wallpaper covered the walls, and soft sunlight streamed through delicate curtains, lending the space a peaceful, almost innocent quality. A rocking horse by the window swayed gently in the breeze, the very sound I had heard earlier. Stepping further into the room, I moved toward its center and began to count silently. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I stopped abruptly. I had said something unthinkably dreadful. I noticed a chair in the far corner where moments before there had been nothing. Now, seated, there was a man dressed entirely in black, his gaze fixed on me. At first, I wondered if it might be my uncle, the one who had recently fallen on hard times and was known to occasionally wander in and stay the night. But this man was different, unmistakably foreign to our family. In that instant, the oppressive fear surged through me with a force 20 times stronger than before. We locked eyes. His eyes were completely white, void of any pupils, as if I were staring into an endless, empty abyss. In that terrifying moment, I took an instinctive step backward. As I did, the man rose slowly, his stature impossibly tall. The rocking horse began to move faster than before, swaying at an abnormal pace while an old mantel clock in the corner started ticking loudly. Overwhelmed, I spun on my heel and bolted down the hall. I barely made it halfway before the door slammed shut behind me. I raced down the stairs in a frantic, stumbling escape. That night, I resolved never to mention what had happened upstairs. The terror was too immense to revisit in conversation. Later that evening, as my mother stoked the fire in the living room's old wood-burning fireplace, I crept into the study. When I was sure everyone was asleep, I retrieved the portrait of the ancestors and set it alight in the flickering flames. I watched, transfixed, as the painting burned away until only ash remained. I came to believe that the man I had seen upstairs was the very figure from that portrait, a restless spirit haunting the upper floor of the house. Somehow, his presence had imbued that space with an inescapable darkness. I didn't know who he was or where the portrait had come from, but I hoped that by burning it, his ghost might finally be put to rest. It was a desperate hope, but it was all I had. When the time finally came for us to move away from Maplewood, I was strangely relieved. I swore to myself that I would never again climb those creaking stairs. Nearly 9 years later, when I was 15, my grandmother passed away. She had sold the house about a year before her death, and most of her belongings had been stored away. After her funeral, held the following week, my family and I gathered a few boxes of her old possessions to sort through together. As we sifted through boxes of photographs and mementos, we settled in with a cold lemonade and fond recollections. It was comforting to see our loved ones smiling in the old pictures, their happiness captured in moments of celebration. But then, near the end of the last box, I experienced a strange déjà vu. I pulled out a large framed picture. It was the portrait of the ancestors. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a copy of that same antique portrait I had burned all those years ago. In that instant, all the terrible memories came rushing back. Memories I had tried so desperately to forget. Shaken, I set the portrait aside and went to fetch more lemonade. When I returned to show my mother the picture, expecting to share a few nervous laughs and some more ancestors' jokes, I froze in horror. There it was, as if time had rewound to that fateful day upstairs. The portrait now lay with its front side down. On the white backside were 2 stick figures, unmistakably the very ones I had drawn 8 years earlier. I stood there, paralyzed with dread, realizing that some things are not so easily erased by time or flame. It was a hot night in August 2009, and I was home alone in our old suburban house in northern New Jersey. My parents had once again headed out for their weekly date night, one of those evenings when, after one too many beers over dinner, they'd end up dozing off at the movies. That particularly scorching August afternoon, after a long run through Riverview Park, a green oasis reminiscent of a miniature Central Park, I was drenched in sweat. To cool off, I took a cold shower and planned to freshen up a bit. Our house, a typical older single-family home without central air, felt stifling, so I decided to open a few windows for better airflow. I cracked open the kitchen window, opened 2 windows on opposite sides of the living room, and even left one in the basement ajar. Since the basement stayed noticeably cooler, I planned on spending the evening there watching movies. After my shower, I got dressed, grabbed some clothes from my closet in my bedroom, and headed downstairs to fix myself a bite. I prepared a simple meal: hot dogs with mustard and a side of coleslaw, a modest, everyday dinner that fit the mood, and took it down to the basement. I turned on the TV and fired up Netflix, ready for a night immersed in new series. I don't recall dozing off immediately, but soon after settling down, I lost consciousness for a short while. When I came to, it was pitch dark outside. The only light in the basement came from the dim glow of the television. The room was freezing, with a cold draft circulating through the space because that one window had been left open far too long. I got up and walked over to the light switch at the foot of the wooden stairs. I closed the open window, turned off the TV, tidied up my dishes, and made my way back upstairs. Once there, I noticed all the lights were still off, a clear sign that my parents hadn't yet returned from their date. I loaded the dishwasher with the remaining dishes and closed the kitchen window. Then, as I passed through the living room, I remembered that the 2 windows there were still open. I went over to shut the one by the television and then the one by the front door. In doing so, I noticed that my mom's decorative vase, filled with artificial flowers, had toppled from the table near the window. The plastic blooms were scattered all over the floor. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Maybe a gust of wind had nudged it, or the curtains had brushed against it. As I bent down to gather the flowers, I heard a faint creak, like the slow turn of a doorknob. I paused, straining my ears. That creak was followed by a soft groan coming from the upstairs hallway. A sharp, piercing pain shot from my stomach to my chest, and I froze. With one hand still holding the vase and the other clutching the stray flowers, I slowly stood up and moved to the window overlooking the front driveway. I scanned for my parents' car, hoping it would be parked there, but the driveway was empty and my heart sank. Quietly and quickly, I set the vase and flowers on the table and crept toward the stairs to peer upward. As I neared the staircase, I heard 2 more creaks on the steps below, causing me to halt abruptly. I waited, listening intently. Nothing else came. I was just a few steps away when I cautiously placed my hand on the railing and peered around the corner into the darkness. I didn't know what to do next. Should I flip on the light and risk alerting a potential intruder that I was coming? Should I drive off to a friend's house? Or perhaps call my parents? Finally, I decided to set my cell phone to silent and retreat to the kitchen near the back door, so I'd have a quick escape route if needed, while sending a text message to my dad. His reply came almost immediately. "It's an old house. It just settles after a really hot day." I explained the noise I'd heard, a doorknob turning, and he brushed it off, suggesting it was probably just a window left open upstairs with the wind pushing a door. Could it all really be explained by an open window? After our brief exchange, a significant portion of my fear began to dissipate. I grabbed a glass of water, turned on the light for the staircase, and started slowly making my way upstairs, though a knot was forming in my stomach once again. Upstairs, I noticed all the doors were ajar, except for my own. The master bedroom and the guest room were to the left, while the living room and my own bedroom lay to the right, with the bathroom at the end of the hallway. As Dad had predicted, my door was only cracked open just enough for a light breeze to push it against the frame, a habit of my mom's on hot days. I exhaled in relief, convinced that Dad had been right all along. I turned on the light in my room, glanced around quickly, placed my water next to my laptop on the nightstand, and headed to the bathroom to get ready for bed. Once in bed, I attempted to sleep while watching my favorite reruns on my laptop. Suddenly, I heard a sound, like something slowly scraping along the door of my closet. I flipped on the bedside lamp in a hurry. The closet door was slightly open. A flurry of questions rushed through my mind. Had it been open all along? Was it closed when I entered the room? I was certain it had been shut when I came in. Before I could collect my thoughts, the most disturbing, eerie, barely audible, and sinister laugh I'd ever heard echoed in the room. No horror movie could ever capture the sound I just heard. In the blink of an eye, as I pushed my laptop aside, the closet door swung open violently and someone stood there. At first, the figure was obscured by my hanging clothes, but as I focused, I saw her. A woman so pale and filthy that I'd never seen anyone like her before. In that brief, horrifying moment, her image burned into my mind forever. She was barefoot, her grimy, caked-on filth evident, and her skin was unnaturally white, streaked with cuts and dried blood running from her face down her arms and legs. She wore what might once have been a white nightgown, now discolored and muddied. A tangle of dirt, blood, and unidentifiable stains. Her sunken gray face with piercing blue eyes looked like a rotting skull, the rest hidden behind my clothes. In a hoarse, scratchy whisper, she asked, "Have you seen my baby?" That was all it took for me to snatch up my cell phone and bolt out of the room. Halfway through my escape from the doorway, I heard her scream, "Give me my baby back!" followed by the clatter of hangers rattling behind me. I ran as fast as I could up to the upstairs bathroom and locked the door behind me. Moments later, a tremendous thud struck the door, accompanied by the derisive, crazed shouting of the woman demanding her baby back. Trembling, I dialed 911. The operator assured me that the police would arrive as quickly as possible. I pressed my feet hard against the door, leaning my back against the bathroom sink, desperate to keep the door shut. But she wouldn't give up. Her shouting morphed into guttural, demonic growls, and her pounding on the door escalated into fierce, violent blows. It felt like an eternity before I finally heard the sound of approaching sirens and the voices of police officers announcing they were entering the house. I screamed at the top of my lungs to let them know I was upstairs. Soon, a cacophony of commands from the officers and the woman's enraged growls filled the air. The police eventually deployed pepper spray, and 3 of them managed to subdue her. Throughout the ordeal, she kept screaming in a frenzied, almost possessed state. I only emerged from the bathroom after the officers assured me that she had left the premises. They later explained that she was likely either under the influence of drugs or a runaway psychiatric patient from the next county over. I tried to convey that she sounded as if she were possessed or something similar, but the officers chalked it up to her missing her medication. Not long after I gave my statement at the police station, my parents returned home. A month later, we moved out of that house. That night, spending an evening alone in a house that suddenly became a stage for terror remains an experience I will never forget. After I finished middle school in a small town like Millfield, New York, my parents trusted me to stay home alone for several days at a stretch. They arranged it so that someone would always be around to look after our old dog, a loyal German shepherd named Balu who needed constant attention. This setup allowed my parents to take long weekend trips out of state while leaving me in charge of the house. Fast forward to a chilly autumn evening in October 2024. My parents had driven off early Friday morning and weren't due back until Sunday night. Everything had gone smoothly, and I was enjoying the rare freedom of having the house all to myself until Saturday evening. When my parents left, I carried my PlayStation into the living room along with a few comfy pillows and a blanket. Balu usually slept there, and I wanted to be nearby in case he needed me in the middle of the night. Around dinner time, after feeding my dog, I texted my mom asking for a little cash to order a pizza from Tony's Pizzeria. I wasn't in the mood to cook that night. I placed the order and settled onto the couch to play a shooter game until time slipped away. Then I heard the doorbell ring. I paused the game, quickly grabbed my windbreaker and moved to the window to see who was there. Standing outside was the pizza delivery guy, a man of medium build with a somewhat rugged, almost medieval look. His disheveled blonde hair and deep-set eyes, encircled by dark bags that hinted he hadn't slept properly in a long time, made me uneasy. Even through the closed door, I could smell the stale odor of cigarette smoke. His gaze was fixed on the camera attached to our doorbell, and there was a hint of worry in his eyes. I unlocked and opened the door about halfway, greeting him with a polite smile. His eyes quickly roamed over me, and a creepy, unsettling grin spread across his face. "Oh, I wasn't expecting someone as young as you," he said in halting English with a heavy accent. I felt a surge of disgust. Unsure of how to respond, I let out a nervous giggle and asked softly, "So, how old are you?" Still smiling, he continued chatting, though I wasn't really paying attention. "Sorry, but I don't answer those kinds of questions," I replied, growing more anxious by the second. He snorted in frustration. I placed the pizza boxes on the sofa and reached into my pocket for the tip I'd prepared for him. "Are your parents home?" he asked suddenly. Quickly, I lied. "Yes, they're in the other room." I hoped he would believe me and leave without further trouble. After all, my mom's minivan and my dad's SUV were parked in the driveway, though neither was in use since they were out of town. Instead of leaving, however, he remarked, "You know, I like this game too. You into shooters?" Gesturing vaguely at the paused game on the TV behind me. Growing increasingly annoyed but not wanting to be rude, I said, "Yes, sure. I'm sorry, but I have to go now," doing my best to end the conversation. The man's face twisted as he took the tip, crumpled the cash in his hand, and muttered something under his breath. I could only catch one chilling sentence before I slammed the door shut. "You'll regret this." I locked the door immediately and peered anxiously through the window until I saw him drive away around the corner. Only then did I allow myself to breathe a little easier. I quickly did a sweep of the house, checking that all windows and doors, and every security latch were firmly locked. A few hours later, feeling exhausted, I decided to lie down and watch TV until I eventually fell asleep, making sure Balu was settled for the night. Before I knew it, sleep had taken over, and I completely forgot about the unsettling encounter. I woke up sometime in the early hours, around 2 in the morning, and found the house still shrouded in darkness. Balu began barking furiously, not with the usual "I need to go out" tone, but with a desperate, alarming sound that meant, "I see someone I shouldn't." Anyone with a dog knows that sound all too well. I stretched and scanned the room, initially seeing nothing out of place. As I was about to try and drift back to sleep, I caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye. A face. Looking to the right at the window, I saw that same delivery guy from earlier. His grin was back, and though he waved at me in an oddly friendly manner, each passing second made his expression look more menacing. My blood ran cold. Why was he here? How long had he been watching me sleep? I bolted upright and my fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. I ran to my room and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed, then returned to the living room with the bat clutched tightly in my hand. When I got there, I saw that the man had moved from the window to the front door. He began to knock gently. "Let's hang out and have some fun," I heard him say from outside in a disturbingly casual tone. "Call the police if you don't get out of my house right now," I shouted back. This time, he banged on the door aggressively. "Damn it," he yelled as the doorknob rattled violently. Balu, now in a state of panic, started barking louder. Desperate, I grabbed the bat and retreated to my room, locking the door and dialing 911 on my cell phone. I explained everything to the emergency operator, but before I could catch my breath, I heard heavy thumps at the front door. The man was trying to break in. I had already texted my parents and they were on their way back. Yet, as the sounds of the door being forced open filled the house, fear overwhelmed me. I whispered into the phone that an intruder had broken into our home, and the operator urged me to stay calm until the police arrived. Suddenly, my phone died, plunging me into panic. Quietly, I crept to the hallway, switched off the light in my room, and hid in the closet with Balu. I gently petted him to keep him from barking and giving away our hiding spot. I could hear the man moving around the house, rifling through things under tables, behind the sofa, and in the hallway cabinets. Then he came right up to my bedroom door. I heard him tug on the doorknob, frustrated, and after a few hard knocks, he managed to wedge his hand through a small gap in the door and fumble with the lock. I heard the click of the lock disengaging before the door creaked open. Inside, my room was pitch black. The man stepped in slowly and stood there, and seconds felt like hours. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle my panicked breathing. I could hear him rummaging through my things, searching under the bed and at my desk. Then my heart sank as I heard the rustle of his hand on the closet door. I'm done for, I thought, paralyzed by fear. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew this could only end badly. Just then, my desperate prayers were answered by the sound of police sirens approaching. "Damn it," the man muttered as he abruptly left my bedroom, fleeing through the house. I heard him kick open the back door and the heavy thud of his footsteps on the wet grass outside. The operator must have relayed our location to the responding officers because soon enough a police officer opened my closet door and whispered, "It's safe now. You can come out." They let me outside on a leash with Balu and sat me down on the edge of the patrol car while they swept through the house, searching for any sign that the intruder might still be lurking around. The officers confirmed that nothing valuable had been taken. It was clear that he wasn't after our possessions. He was after me. That realization will haunt me for the rest of my life. The investigation uncovered plenty of evidence of a break-in, but the case eventually went cold. The man was never caught, and his identity remains unknown. Later, I learned that he had a history of trespassing and had even skipped court dates on previous charges. The fact that he's still out there somewhere sends chills down my spine. Now, I know for sure that I'll never open the door to a stranger again when I'm home alone. I used to long for the nights when my mother would slip into an elegant evening dress, each sentence of her explanations punctuated by the click-clack of her high heels as she strode proudly toward the front door. Before leaving, she'd press a deep red kiss onto my forehead, a silent promise of mystery before disappearing with her nighttime date. Nights like that were rare now, especially when my single mother worked 12-hour shifts at the local nursing home and then came home to a long evening of wine, blaring TV, and heated arguments with her kids. But this night was different. The universe had somehow aligned the plans of everyone in our household so that I'd have at least 5 hours completely to myself, a luxury I rarely enjoyed. I was holed up in my room in our 3-story Victorian home in a quiet suburb on the outskirts of Chicago. My secret stash of snacks was scattered all over my bed, and the one-family laptop belonged entirely to me. I couldn't decide what to do first. Should I watch a classic American horror film, belt out some karaoke hits on YouTube, or throw a one-girl dance party? In the end, I settled on a horror movie, turning off all the lights to set the perfect mood. Not long after I passed the 30-minute mark, I began to hear a faint giggling in the distance. For a few seconds, I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than part of the movie's sound effects. But when I paused the film and the sound persisted, my heart skipped a beat. I froze. Unsure of what to do, I waited, hoping something would happen. When nothing did, I shifted my weight in bed, the frame creaking under me, and planted both feet firmly on the floor. I waited a few more minutes, reasoning that maybe one of my siblings had come home early to play a prank, or perhaps it was one of the neighbor's kids. Whatever it was, I was a cautious 16-year-old who didn't take risks lightly. Finally, the thought struck me to search for something to defend myself with. I shared a room with my 2 little sisters, ages 6 and 8, in a house that had been thoroughly child-proofed. My best bet was a hefty sports trophy from our local high school football team, a far cry from a real weapon, but better than nothing. Clutching the trophy, I listened as the giggling grew louder and closer, morphing into full-blown chuckles. I couldn't tell if I should wait to be found or take matters into my own hands. I took another long, deliberate look at the trophy in my hands and decided to stay put a while longer. With each passing minute, the laughter grew in volume and wildness. It sounded like the giggles of a child who knew his parents were on their way to find him during a game of hide-and-seek. But layered over, that was a maniacal tone that could only belong to an adult. Then I heard the scraping of chairs across our hardwood floor, as if someone were dragging them out of the way with a single, unnerving purpose. A slick, slobbery, wet sound followed. A noise so disturbingly familiar, yet unlike anything I'd heard before. Whoever was in our kitchen was slashing, tearing, and crushing something in his grasp. I heard creaks and shrieks, and in that moment, I could only imagine a deranged psychopath with an appetite for violence. Someone who'd break into houses to tear apart large animals. And throughout it all, he laughed. Fear gripped me. A stranger was in our kitchen, laughing maniacally as if preparing himself a snack right on our counter. An intruder was downstairs, the very same floor where I'd left my phone. I glanced at my laptop, wondering desperately if the police ever checked their email. Deciding to try anyway, I crept back toward my bed. My trembling fingers struggled to type slowly and quietly, but eventually I managed to send an email and post a desperate call for help on social media. It felt like an agonizing 7 minutes passed before I heard the sound of a car pulling into our driveway. It didn't sound like a police siren. Heavy footsteps pounded as someone ran to our front door, hastily jiggling a key in the lock before flinging it open. For a brief moment, the maniacal laughter ceased, only to erupt again into a booming guffaw. A blood-curdling scream shattered the silence of the neighborhood, and whoever had screamed spun around and bolted out onto the street, their shrieks echoing behind them. The unhinged laughter followed, and at last I mustered the courage to dash to my bedroom window. Peering out, I saw my sister running down the street, screaming at the top of her lungs to attract as much attention as possible, and it seemed to be working. In the opposite direction, a naked man streaked by, drenched in a massive amount of blood, a sight I had only ever seen on late-night true crime shows. Even as he disappeared from view, his laughter still rang out loudly. I watched from the window as a small crowd began to gather right outside our house. My sister hadn't stopped screaming. It was clear that she wasn't just seeking attention, but was genuinely hysterical. I didn't dare go downstairs to see what had driven her to that state. The crowd swelled further as flashing red and blue lights arrived, and heavy footsteps began storming into our home. I heard curses and guttural sounds downstairs until, finally, someone shouted out. The only sound I could manage was a strangled squeak. A female police officer appeared in our doorway and asked if I was all right. Without a moment's hesitation, she instructed me to follow her, eyes closed, for my own safety. A rather ironic piece of advice for a rebellious teenager. As we descended the creaking stairs, I felt her grip tighten on my arm, and I couldn't resist stealing a glance. With my eyes squeezed shut, I caught sight of a scene that would forever haunt me. The neatly arranged, dismembered body parts of my mother lay beside her severed head on our kitchen counter. Overwhelmed by terror and disbelief, I blacked out. 47 minutes. That's how long I listened, paralyzed, as my mother was torn apart, shredded, mutilated, and even consumed. The culprit didn't linger. He dashed straight to the nursing home where he worked, heading directly to his room and then to bed. He laughed when they strapped him to the bed. He laughed when he was handcuffed and led away. He laughed when he was locked in a cell. And he laughed even as he looked me straight in the eyes in the courtroom when his sentence was read aloud. I wouldn't be surprised if he was still laughing when they bound him to that chair for the last time. He will never laugh again, and neither will my mother. I turned 18 in 2008, and on my birthday, due to reasons I won't bore you with, I packed up my belongings and left home. For the next 4 years, I lived in my car while juggling 2 jobs. I worked as a barista from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., and then as a dishwasher from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. My plan was simple: work hard until I saved enough money for my own place, then either enroll in college or find a more stable job. Looking back, I have no idea how I managed it, but by the time I was 22, I had saved a decent sum. That's when I began searching for a semi-permanent living situation. At that point, I was living in Philadelphia, a city that, despite being less expensive than some of today's metropolises, was still far from cheap. After months of inquiries and endless phone calls, I was finally put in touch with Mr. Anderson, an older gentleman who was renting out a modest 2-bedroom house with 1 bathroom in the Fishtown neighborhood at a price well below market value. The catch, because affordable housing almost always has one, was that the house had been terribly neglected. It had sat empty for a year and desperately needed work before anyone could comfortably live there. After all, I had spent 4 years living in a car. As long as running water was available, any upgrade was welcome. I moved into the house in the fall of 2012. Before I settled in, Mr. Anderson gave me a tour. He was a small, jovial old man, kind-hearted, but perhaps not the sharpest due to his age. During the tour, he led me through the cramped bathroom, then the master bedroom, then back to the bathroom and the bedroom again. Just as he was about to lead me into the bathroom for the 3rd time, I gently steered him down the hallway instead. The house was livable, albeit worn and shabby. Dim light from outdated fixtures cast long shadows across peeling wallpaper. In many rooms, old water stains had discolored the ceiling from past leaks. The kitchen faucet was broken, the bathtub was badly damaged, and some of the cabinet handles practically fell off in my hand. It was a rundown house in a neighborhood filled with bars and small diners, but despite its flaws, it was mine. I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear as Mr. Anderson handed me the keys. "It's a solid house with good bones. Now it's up to you to fix it up," he said, his tone half joking yet matter-of-fact. Before he left, he lingered in the doorway, one hand on his chin as he peered back into the house. I tried to follow his gaze, but couldn't quite tell what he was seeing. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah, just that something about that bathroom looks a little off, even though I can't quite put my finger on it, but really, it's a good house with solid bones. Now you just have to take care of it." With that, he gave me a nod and left me to unpack. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed the feel of having a real house. It didn't matter how run down the place was. As long as there was an accessible bathroom and a proper mattress, I felt like a king. After spending a few days cleaning and organizing, I invited my sister and her fiancé over for dinner. It might sound silly, but my newfound ability to host guests made me proud. In no time, I had settled comfortably into my new home. That very evening, after my guests had left, I took a shower. The bathroom didn't have the usual mirror above the sink. Instead, there was a wide, floor-to-ceiling mirror on the wall to the left of the vanity. After finishing my shower, I stepped out and went over to the mirror. As I raised my hand to wipe away some steam, I noticed something odd. In the condensation, right at eye level, was the word "hello" spelled out. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Somehow, the letters looked deliberately arranged. It was hard to believe that this was just a trick of the steam. My sister was only moments away from leaving the bathroom. Could it be that she had written the word with her finger, and the steam had revealed it only after my shower? I nearly texted her a message, but the thought seemed ridiculous, and even a bit paranoid. I wiped the mirror clean and went to bed, eventually forgetting about it. The following week brought a promotion at one of my jobs, and although I was grateful for the extra income, my new position meant longer workdays. I also began to realize that some of the repairs around the house were beyond my capabilities, so I started hiring contractors for the heavy work. It was frustrating to have the house all to myself at night, but my schedule left me little choice. Generally, things went smoothly, except that occasionally I'd be awoken in the middle of the night by an unidentifiable noise. About a month into living in the house, I encountered another message on that same mirror. After another long day at work, I returned home and took a shower. When I pulled back the shower curtain and stepped out, I glanced at the glass and saw, written in the condensation, these words: "Staying long?" I could dismiss one stray letter as a coincidence, but 2 full words forming a question. That was no accident. Someone had been in my bathroom not too long ago. I had contractors coming in and out of the house regularly, so one of them might have left a message, but why? I quickly got dressed and, with a hand on the bathroom doorknob, paused as the thought struck me that whoever had written this might still be nearby. I slowly opened the door just a crack and peered down the dark hallway in both directions. I listened very carefully, but I heard nothing. I walked through the house, a short trip given its small size, and searched for anything out of place. All the doors were locked, the windows were shut, and none of my personal items seemed disturbed. If someone had broken in, they had long since vanished. That second message left me unsettled for days. Every night, I triple-checked that all the windows and doors were securely locked. I inspected every possible hiding spot in my modest home before going to sleep. And yet, despite knowing the house was secure, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A month passed without further incident, and I was nearly beginning to feel at home in my new place, until one Friday morning, shortly after 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that I couldn't immediately explain. Unlike the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling, the silence was complete. Then, as I turned my head, I realized that my bedroom door, which I was sure I had closed, was left wide open. I stared down the hallway, feeling as if I were gazing into a bottomless black void. The darkness was impenetrable. I waited for my eyes to adjust, for the familiar shapes of my home to emerge, but they never did. I couldn't see anything, and yet I felt as though something was watching me from just a few feet beyond my bedroom threshold, observing, waiting. Somehow, I mustered the courage to get out of bed and approach the door. When I reached for the knob, I gripped it tightly and slammed the door shut. I didn't dare look out into the hallway. I didn't even peek my head out for a closer look. None of the other doors in the house had locks, except for the bathroom door, so I pushed a small bookshelf in front of the bedroom door. It wasn't much of a barrier. An intruder could probably force it open, but at least the noise would alert me if something were there. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I seriously considered escaping through a window. I was nearly late by the time I finally mustered the courage to check the house one more time before heading out. As always, I found nothing amiss. That evening, after a long day and a reluctant return to my home, I ate dinner quickly and jumped in the shower. I remember standing in the bathtub for a long time, pondering the unsettling situation. I'd heard horror stories about people who discovered others living undetected in their homes. Perhaps I had unwittingly become a victim of some sort of haunting. But if so, where exactly were they hiding? There was no obvious nook or cranny in this small house. I had already searched every closet, pantry, and cabinet. The interior couldn't be accessed from the crawlspace beneath the house, and the ventilation ducts were far too small for a person to squeeze through. Then, suddenly, I heard a faint clicking, so tiny that I almost missed it. I yanked the shower curtain back and clutched my bottle of shampoo as if it were a weapon. As expected, no one was in the room, but on the mirror, a new message had appeared, this time in bold, making it the easiest to read of all. 3 chilling words were scrawled there. I see you. A horrifying mix of fear, confusion, and anger churned in my stomach. In the end, anger overpowered everything else. I quickly dried off, grabbed some clothes, and reached for my cell phone that I'd left on the bathroom counter. I dialed Mr. Anderson's number while staring fixedly at that cursed mirror as it continued to taunt me with its silent message. I thought it was too late for him to be awake, but to my surprise, he answered. He began asking how I was faring in my new home before I cut him off. "You have to tell me," I demanded. "Is there any way someone could get into this house?" I explained. "I check every window and door every night. I search every closet, every pantry, every shelf, but still, something isn't right. Please tell me if there's some access point I don't know about." Mr. Anderson didn't seem to fully understand my question. "What do you mean, something coming in? Let me know if you start having problems with pests. My last tenant used to complain about rats." "Yeah, I get rats. But aside from the doors and windows, how else could someone get in?" "Well," he replied slowly, There are, of course, the air vents, and there used to be a fireplace that we sealed off a long time ago. And then there's the crawl space, although I'm sure you've already looked there. I knew the house had a crawl space, but I'd never really had a reason to explore it. I couldn't even find the entrance, even after tearing up the carpet throughout the house. It was likely hidden beneath a wooden floor panel over the access door, making it an unlikely entry point for anyone. "How do I get down to the crawl space?" I asked. "You should take a closer look at it," Mr. Anderson insisted. Almost losing my temper, I nearly slammed the phone down. "I will, but seriously, where is the entrance?" "It's in the floor of the bathroom cabinet." I glanced around, certain I'd misheard him. Either that or he was confused again. "What?" "I know it sounds strange, but that's where it is, because this room wasn't always a bathroom." "But this bathroom doesn't even have a cabinet," I protested. "Oh, it does. It's built right next to the vanity on the left." I looked back at the mirror, the long, oversized mirror that had puzzled me from the start. I had always found it odd that such a spacious bathroom featured a built-in mirror stretching from floor to ceiling. What had Mr. Anderson mentioned the first time he came by? That something about the bathroom looked different. I set my phone on the sink and stepped closer to the mirror. I felt along the frame for a moment, searching for a latch. Then, using both hands, I grabbed a section of the right side of the frame. With a firm tug, the mirror swung open like a door to reveal a large walk-in cabinet. I heard Mr. Anderson say something on the other end of the line, but I was too shocked to respond. Behind the cabinet lay a square opening that, I assumed, led down to the crawl space beneath the house. The cabinet's floor was cluttered with all sorts of junk: dirty sheets, fast food wrappers, beer cans, and, to my dismay, some of my own belongings. Small items I thought were long lost: a lone sock, an old toothbrush, a comb, and a small framed photo of me, my sister, and our old family dog. I crouched down to pick up the photo, pausing in the doorway as I stared at my younger, smiling self. Then I heard someone say my name over the phone, but the voice on the line didn't sound like Mr. Anderson's at all. It was too deep, too clear, too close. I looked up, and there, peering out from the opening in the cabinet floor, was a man. He smiled at me, his eyes wide and his pupils dilated, his grin so unnervingly broad it hurt to look at it. His face was the only part visible above the cabinet. The harsh light made it seem as though a headless face was grinning at me from the dark recesses behind. Horrified, I leapt to my feet and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, and without a second thought, I drove straight to my sister's house. The very next day, I went to the police station to file a report. An officer came to my sister's place to examine the scene, and I showed him the hidden cabinet that led to the crawl space. My best guess was that an intruder had snuck into the house during the year it stood empty, and when he saw the house being prepped for sale, he had concealed himself in that tiny space. Why he stayed, or why he left messages, I can't say for certain. Judging by his actions and the little I saw of him, it's safe to assume he wasn't entirely of sound mind. Unfortunately, the man was never found. As far as I know, he's still somewhere in that neighborhood. Hell, he could even still be in that very house. After that, I moved to another state and have since lived in studio apartments. The very thought of living in a big house with all its rooms, nooks, and hidden corners fills me with dread. It wasn't just houses that left a bad impression on me after that incident. It was mirrors, too. Now, whenever I visit a friend or stay in a hotel, I make it a point to inspect the bathroom mirror carefully. I shine a light directly into it and tap it with my finger. The worst part of it all, though, was what I discovered when I revisited that bathroom with the police. I stepped back into the old cabinet, closed the door, and looked into the mirror. Instead of the reflection of the back of the cabinet, I saw the face of the officer staring back at me from the other side of the glass. The first thing you should know about me is that I'm a night owl. I never go to sleep until well after dawn, a habit that's been ingrained in me since childhood. I was homeschooled, and somehow my mother never complained about my unconventional schedule. She herself had long struggled with agoraphobia and, as I suspect, a touch of schizophrenia. Working from home as an accountant in our modest Brooklyn apartment, she kindly adjusted her entire day to accommodate mine. Despite her many struggles, she devoted herself wholeheartedly to my well-being. I suppose that's just what mothers do. Anyway, my mother passed away 2.5 years ago, leaving me as the sole remnant of a fractured family. My father abandoned us when I was 10, vanishing into the maze of New York City and never looking back, and my grandparents had long been gone. Inheriting the old family house was bittersweet. It was a sprawling, creaking relic of a bygone era, a brownstone built in the 1920s on the outskirts of Brooklyn that had seen better days. The house was too large, too isolated, and filled with memories of my mother for me to continue living there alone. Even if I'd had someone with me, every creak and shadow would have been a painful reminder of what I'd lost. So, after much deliberation, I decided to sell it to a young family in search of a fresh start, and I moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Williamsburg, a neighborhood where the streets hummed with life and the scent of artisanal coffee was as common as the sound of subway trains rumbling overhead. But enough about my sorrowful past. It was 3 nights ago, around 2 a.m., when I was sprawled on my worn-out couch, nibbling on leftover bagel bites from the night before while binge-watching the 7th episode of an old sitcom rerun, that I first heard the knock at my door. A bizarre memory from before I moved in came to mind. Just weeks prior, an elderly tenant in our building had passed away quietly in her apartment. She lived alone, and it wasn't until nearly a month later that anyone noticed she'd been gone. Rumor had it that the decomposition fluids had seeped through the worn-out floorboards and dripped down into the living room of the unit below, leaving a stench that no one in the building could ignore. No pun intended. After that unsettling incident, all the residents in our building banded together in a sort of informal watch group. We made it a point to check on one another, even if it meant awkwardly leaning through closed doors from a safe distance. I'd endured several long, uncomfortable conversations with neighbors who acted as though striking up a chat was their full-time job, even when I desperately craved silence. They'd call out a bright, "Hey, how's it going today?" listen half-heartedly as I mumbled back a response, and then vanish as quickly as they'd appeared. Tomorrow, someone else would bear the burden of conversation. It was odd, to say the least. So, when I heard that midnight knock, the timing was strange, but it initially seemed like nothing more than an overly cautious neighbor, likely troubled by insomnia. In the dim glow of my living room, I fumbled around in search of my face mask and called out, "Who's there?" only to be met with silence. As I crept toward the door, my hand hovering just inches from the handle, the knocking resumed, this time more insistent. I froze, hand suspended mid-motion. I repeated my question in a trembling voice that even I didn't recognize, but still received only silence. Finally, I peered through the peephole. The hallway beyond was completely empty. I exhaled slowly, convincing myself that it was probably one of those mischievous local kids, always seen darting through the corridors even during the lingering days of quarantine, playing a prank. That night, as I lay awake staring at my ceiling, relief washed over me with the first hint of sunrise. I nearly forgot about that odd occurrence, until the following night when it happened all over again. I'd spent the bulk of the day drowning the isolation in one too many cups of lukewarm coffee and stale bagels, when a peculiar odor began to pervade my small kitchen. I couldn't quite pinpoint where it was coming from, so I methodically inspected the fridge and the cramped pantry, hoping to find some spoiled food I might toss out. I found nothing amiss. No moldy leftovers, no rotten fruit. Maybe a rodent had snuck in and met its unfortunate end behind the counters. I wasn't sure. But one thing was undeniable. Something stank terribly. As I hurriedly restowed my groceries, the knocking came again. The sound startled me so completely that the buttered bagel I was holding slipped from my grasp and splattered on the linoleum floor. My heart pounded like a jackhammer against my ribs, and I could almost feel the blood rushing through my veins. My vision blurred, the stark white of my walls blending with hazy patches that threatened to swallow my sight. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was experiencing a heart attack. Carefully, I inched across the slick floor toward the front door. And then it hit me. My rising panic wasn't solely because of the relentless knocking, but because of where it was coming from. Despite my better judgment, I turned around, my eyes fixed on the door to my guest room, inside my own apartment. The knocking wasn't coming from outside at all. I entertained the thought of bolting to the safety of the front exit, but before I could decide, I saw the doorknob begin to turn on its own. It rotated slowly, the dry metal squealing softly in the stillness of the night. Without thinking, my body moved as though on autopilot. I found myself stepping from the living room toward the door of the guest room, inside my apartment. My mind screamed to retreat, but curiosity and dread mingled into a paralyzing force. I bolted back to the relative sanctuary of my bedroom, desperately trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Yet, as I stole a glance toward the adjacent door, I swear, I saw a pallid, bony hand poised to cross the threshold. I'm certain of one thing: I did not sleep a wink that night. When morning finally broke, I felt a transient sense of relief. A hope that the light flooding my modest apartment would chase away the nightmares of the dark, but that relief was ephemeral. I knew the night was coming, and with it the terror. Desperate for some reassurance, I rang one of my neighbors. I hesitated to even utter the word ghost out loud, not even to myself. The woman who lived directly across the hall answered through the thin crack of her barely ajar door, her voice quiet and apologetic as she insisted she'd noticed nothing unusual. The neighbor beside her, I later learned, hadn't even been home when I'd knocked. I might have caught the faint sound of muffled footsteps just after my call, but I couldn't be sure. It all blended into a haze of uncertainty. In a final attempt to fend off the mounting dread, I called two of my closest friends to see if I could crash at one of their places or have one of them come over for the night. Neither was willing. They argued that it was far too dangerous to venture into unfamiliar spaces given how volatile things had become in the city. I couldn't blame them, honestly. Lena even offered to keep me company over a video call, but the idea of worrying over something that might not even be real seemed absurd in light of the genuine chaos swirling around us. I thanked her politely and ended the call. In the end, I was alone. Then came the voices, whispering doubts in my mind, harsh and unyielding. A voice, eerily reminiscent of my father's gruff tone, repeatedly murmured that I was losing my grip on reality. "Just like your mother," it sneered. "You're going crazy, insane, just like her." It repeated these words over and over, gnawing at my sanity. And maybe it was true. Perhaps my mind had always been perched on a fragile precipice, and the crushing isolation had finally pushed it over the edge. It wouldn't have been unprecedented or even surprising. Everyone struggles, right? "Anna, you're not special just because you're in pain," the voice insisted, and I was forced to agree in silence. The facts were increasingly bizarre. I smelled things, I heard things, and I saw, yes, I saw something. Every unusual occurrence might have had a mundane explanation. A leaky pipe, a rotten odor emanating from a neighboring unit, local kids playing practical jokes in the hall, or even a hidden outbreak of toxic mold creeping beneath my newly painted wallpaper that might be distorting my vision. Or maybe, just maybe, I was simply unraveling. Either way, I clung to the possibility of a rational explanation. With those grim thoughts echoing in my mind like a mantra, I steeled myself for the inevitable darkness of the coming night. And, as if on cue, the third night arrived. With each tick of the clock, the certainty of my rational arguments began to crumble. I stared at the hands as they inched closer to midnight, 10, 11, and then 12. I was drenched in sweat, trembling uncontrollably, and my stomach rumbled with a gnawing hunger, yet I dared not leave the safety of my bedroom. Time dragged interminably. Every minute felt like an eternity as I fixated on the clock. They say a watched pot never boils, and I couldn't help but feel that truth. 1 o'clock passed, then 2. I tried to steady myself, but in the recesses of my mind, all I could think about was the incessant knocking at my door. And then it happened again. I knew it was coming when I detected a whiff of a repulsive odor. A stench so revolting it was as if a slab of decaying meat had materialized right on the other side of my door. I covered my mouth and nose, hoping desperately to block out the smell, but it only grew stronger. It burned through my nostrils like a noxious chemical spill, and instinctively I gagged. Before I could recover, I heard it once more. A knock, followed by another almost immediately after. This time, the sound was softer, languid, almost as if it were teasing me, like the gentle rapping of a parent calling from another room. Knock, knock, an ordinary sound I'd heard hundreds of times before suddenly transformed into the harbinger of my deepest nightmare. Shortly thereafter, the doorknob began to turn, just as it had on the previous night. Slowly at first, as if no great urgency lay behind its movement. I closed my eyes and drew a deep, calming breath. I had bolted the door. I had double-checked it. And yet, the knob jerked violently, spinning faster and faster as if whatever force was outside demanded entry. I could no longer contain my terror. My vision blurred with tears as I repeated to myself that the door was locked. Then, in a single horrifying moment, the knob snapped. A sharp crack echoed through the silence as the door swung open. The soft creak of ancient wood told me that the barrier between me and the unknown was gone. Like a moth helplessly drawn to a flame, I fixed my gaze on the open doorway. 2 impossibly thin arms emerged from the darkness, their long, claw-like nails digging into the frame as a gaunt, emaciated figure slowly crawled onto my apartment's worn floor. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were 2 milky, vacant orbs, devoid of life yet fixated upon me with an almost predatory intensity. In sheer panic, I staggered back toward the bathroom, my last refuge in that labyrinth of terror. In the midst of my frantic retreat, I felt a grip seize my ankle. I looked down to see the pale, rotting skin around a bony hand, its dark, spidery veins pulsing as they crept upward along my leg. I screamed, kicked, and somehow managed to lock the bathroom door behind me. With no other escape, I huddled in a tight ball at the far end of the cramped bathroom, trying desperately to render myself invisible in the oppressive darkness. I knew neither I nor the intruder would truly be safe for long. The inky veins snaked from my ankle up to my calf, then my knee, and I dreaded the moment they would creep further. In my desperation, I clung to the memory of my mother, hoping that even a faint recollection of her gentle warmth might soothe my frenzied heart. But the memories did nothing to quell the chaos in my mind, a tumult of shattered moments and foggy thoughts. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, deafening in its intensity. Outside, I heard the sound of long, scraping nails dragging slowly over the bathroom door, as if the creature was toying with me, its fingertips caressing the wood in a disturbingly tender manner, like a child delighted with a new toy destined for destruction. Closing my eyes and bracing myself for what I knew was inevitable, I realized with a sinking dread that sooner or later, it would come knocking again. The addiction slowly claimed our mother along with us, carrying her off in its wake as if swaying her in a lullaby that finally lulled her to sleep. I remember how, as her molars began to fall out, she would leave them by the bathtub. I was only 7 then, and I saved those lost pieces in a little matchbox, determined to keep them safe so they wouldn't vanish forever. Maybe one day we could put them back together again. Our modest townhouse in a small suburb outside Cleveland was falling apart around us. The ceilings bore the scars of water damage, and the lower steps were riddled with dry rot. In winter, even the old radiators rusted and dripped orange flecks. But it was still our home, and my older sister Angie did her best to transform it into something that felt like a real home. Angie cared for me in every way she could. She tended to my scrapes with crooked bandages on bruised knees and prepared lukewarm meals heated in the microwave when nothing else was available. She would tell me ghost stories, and when I was too frightened to sleep alone, she didn't mind if I crawled into her bed. I remember how she taught me to dance, barefoot on the threadbare living room rug, with the TV's old stereo blaring pop music while we swayed our hips long before we were old enough to know any better. Angie always made sure I was the first to take a hot shower, even if that meant she had to settle for cold water herself. Every morning, she combed my hair before school, even when I protested, and even when she ended up snapping at me for the tangles. Angie had dark hair like whoever our father had been, though I was born with blonde locks. I believe she was desperate to be blonde herself, trying to mirror the iconic look of a famous blonde actress like Pamela Anderson, just as Mama once had been. I sometimes wondered if she thought it might bring them closer together, easing Mama's constant reminders of her absent father. I would have given anything to feel Angie's hands in my hair again, even if it hurt. But when I turned 18, Angie left for Los Angeles and never came back. I still dream of her sometimes. Keeping up with our mother was impossible. We learned early that no matter how fast we ran, she would always leave us behind. It only made things harder. On the nights when she drank lightly, she'd beam with a strange sort of brightness, waking us at 3 a.m. with pancakes drenched in thick, sweet maple syrup. There were days when, if the weather was nice and she was tired of being alone in her drunken stupor, she would call our school from a payphone near the train station and announce that we had both come down with summer sickness and that we were going to the beach instead of school that day. I remember being 9 years old, riding in the back seat after one of those days at the ocean, sucking the salt from my fingers. Angie had just had her hair dyed blonde that week, and her best friend Jenna had helped her lean over the kitchen sink. From behind, I couldn't tell which of them was the mother and which was the daughter. The stereo played loud pop hits, the windows were rolled down, and the dusky sky spilled into our car. When Mama drank heavily, she was a different creature entirely. Her hair would be pinned up like that of a beauty queen, her eyes glazed and rimmed with clumps of smudged makeup. Sometimes she would disappear for a day or two without explanation. One morning, we'd awaken in an empty house with the refrigerator mysteriously restocked and a smeared lipstick kiss scribbled on a post-it taped to the front door, promising that she'd be back soon. Other nights, she'd bring strangers home, filling the table with beer cans and overflowing ashtrays, and filling the rooms with smoke. We would sleep under pillows in a futile attempt to drown out the music that thundered until dawn, only to wake up in the morning with unfamiliar faces at the kitchen table, asking where we kept the coffee. When Mama drank too little, she began to crumble. She stopped buying groceries, leaving the refrigerator gaping like a wound in the wall. Chain smoking through the day, she left burnt cigarette holes in the wallpaper near the staircase as if the very walls were sick and decaying. She barely slept, wandering the house with dark, half-moon eyes and raw, swollen ankles. She'd scream at the slightest provocation. I remember once spilling juice on the couch. She stared at me with dead, unseeing eyes, hauled me down onto the carpet, and then methodically carried every single cushion outside to set them on fire. Angie would stand by the window for a while before joining me on the floor, our backs pressed against the skeletal frame of the old sofa, our heads resting in the hollows of our collarbones. And when Mama drank too much, well, that was the worst. She would laugh too loudly and too long at everything until her mouth trembled and tears welled up over her cereal at the breakfast table. Angie would retreat into herself whenever Mama was like that, slipping into a quiet, almost meditative state where she couldn't hurt anyone. She'd stay up until morning watching old black and white movies on TV and whispering the lines she'd memorized as if they were sacred prayers. I remember, at the age of 5, finding Mama lying lifeless on her bed and crying, convinced she would never wake up. Angie wiped away my tears and told me that Mama was just sleeping, just like the princesses in my picture book. We would sit together on Mama's bed, waiting for her to wake up. As we grew older, it was always me who had to lift her from the bathroom floor, and Angie would help her into bed, smoothing her hair away from her face and cleaning up the mess of vomit and wet spots. Watching her, I realized without a doubt that Angie had, in many ways, become the mother. It was October, and I was 13 while Angie was 16. It was a Wednesday evening and Mama had been gone for 2 days. That morning, she'd called from a payphone by the train station, her voice all slurred, telling us she was having the best time with all her new friends and hoping we were doing okay. When she asked if I was having a good birthday, I hung up. My birthday had been the day before. Angie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip gloss and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she'd gotten the money for them. I didn't care. We had taken the bus with Jenna to the beach, eaten the birthday cake she'd baked for me, sand mixed with powdered sugar. It tasted of sweetness and salt, and I savored every bite and every grain of sugar stuck to my teeth. We watched the sunset while Angie snapped grainy photos on her old flip phone, and as I blew out the candles, I silently wished that Mama wouldn't come home, that she would just stay away this time. That Wednesday evening, however, Angie and I barely spoke. Anger hung thick between us, seeping through the creaking floorboards. It all began when she stumbled on the last step. We both laughed. Angie threw her head back, and the gap between her front teeth caught the light. As I bent over to help her up, I caught a whiff of her breath, warm against the freckles on my cheek. I let go of her arms, and she fell again, hitting the floor with a grin as she shook the loose strands of her hair free. Her breath reeked of whiskey. I couldn't bear to keep lifting her again and again. I couldn't watch her keep falling, just as Mama had. I knew then that, like Mama, she might never get up again. I stared down at her, blonde hair falling into her eyes, and all I could see was our mother. Then, as if in a sudden panic, I bolted. My bare feet pounded down the hall like frantic heartbeats. I raced to the kitchen and dumped every bottle of alcohol we had into the sink, shoving Angie aside as she tried to stop me. Alcohol dripped off her fingers as she clutched my shoulders, forcing me to drop the final bottle. It shattered between us on the floor. Shards of glass sparkling like fragments of stars that we'd once believed we could put back together someday. Outside, through the open windows, the sky glowed a pale gold, the clouds a tangled mix of pink and cream smeared along the horizon. I wept then, watching Angie on her knees gather the broken pieces. That was Angie, forever trying to mend things even when it was too late. The aroma of dinner pulled me away from my room, a deceptive, familiar pain in my chest reminding me that food was still a comfort. Angie was cooking pasta, real, hearty food, not another microwave dinner. She set the table while a soft ballad played from an old CD player, the kind that reminded you of simpler times, and she swayed gently as she stirred a rich, warm tomato sauce. With every bite, as we ate in silence, I forgave her a little more. Mama had never cooked dinner, never remembered that my favorite meal had been spaghetti since I was a child, and she was never sober long enough to sit with us at the table. Angie was not Mama. We began washing the dishes when we first heard it. A faint sound. A moth crawled along the inside of the window, and I cracked it open to let it flutter out into the darkness. From the backyard came a soft noise. I tilted my head, listening. It sounded like someone crying from far away. I thought it might be little Mikey, the 2-year-old neighbor, having a tantrum. Or maybe it was Lucky, the stray cat that roamed our block begging for food as she sometimes did. I had always wanted to feed that cat, even though she would wrap around my ankles. But Angie always warned me that once you start giving, they never stop taking. Looking back, I doubt she was talking about the cat at all. Angie strung up the Christmas lights along the porch, and we sat on plastic lawn chairs watching the night sky. When we were little, we'd sit outside as Angie pointed out the names of every constellation and spun wild stories about how they had come to hang in the heavens. I had to grow up before I realized that she had made it all up as she went along. It was a game we still enjoyed, making ridiculous up stories about the shapes we saw in the dark. "Ah, look over there. That's the city light," she would say, nodding sagely. It fell from God's convertible window and was never picked up again. "Of course," I'd reply with a wave of my hand, gesturing upward, past the power lines. "Right next to the ashtray left by angels on their smoke break. Yeah, and they say if you make a wish on it, all your dreams will come true." Angie would grin mischievously. Then her laughter faded into something quieter, her voice soft as she gazed at the sky full of dead stars. "Let's wish on it, Em. Let's make a wish." And so we did. The sound of crying broke through our reverie, this time much closer and unmistakably human. We exchanged puzzled looks. Angie shrugged and I blinked into the dark. It sounded like a baby, lost, tired, and alone. "Could that be Mikey?" I asked slowly, getting to my feet. "Maybe he wandered to the back. Damn it, should we call Connie and tell her to get him?" Angie said nothing, and I sighed, rolling my eyes. "I guess I'll take care of it." I stepped off the porch, the soft grass cool under my bare feet. The air smelled of rain, fresh, clean, full of promise yet unfulfilled. Angie's voice came, taut with tension. I turned to her and smiled, only to see the smile fade as her eyes locked onto something outside. Come inside now." She stared into the darkness, her hand reaching behind her back as if searching for a door bolt. I froze, realizing with a jolt that I had found what she was looking for. Huddled in the bushes beside the back fence was a figure, crouched with knees tucked neatly under a determined chin, arms wrapped around legs. The person's mouth moved slowly in a silent, stuttering cry, as if imitating the sound of weeping, opening and closing in the dark. Suddenly, the figure straightened up, its face hidden in shadow. It was tall and unnervingly thin, too thin to be an ordinary person. Panic drove me into action. Instincts honed from days when we'd once climbed trees and ran as if our lives depended on it. I was faster than Angie. I grabbed her and dragged her inside, slamming and bolting the door behind us so hard that I could hear it thump on the frame. We could hear heavy footsteps approaching, long, deliberate steps echoing through the house. Angie clutched my hand, turning me toward her, her grip on my shoulders fierce. "Don't look back, Em. Don't you dare look back." Instinct made me glance over my shoulder into the dark. Angie gripped my face, shaking her head firmly. In that moment, I knew she meant every word. Her voice broke as she cleared her throat, her hand squeezing mine so hard that her nails dug in, anchoring us both. I looked down at our intertwined fingers, two souls grown from the same fragile core. "I'm calling the police. Everything will..." Her voice faltered, stammering. Tears streamed down her lashes, falling like the promise of rain. Angie never cried, at least not like this. "Your cell phone's on the porch," she whispered, and bile rose in my throat. It was charging upstairs. Then, a soft, deliberate tapping filled the silence. Angie turned toward the window. Her eyes went wide, the whites showing in her shock. Someone's forehead was knocking slowly against the glass, again and again, a rhythmic assault. Soon, the knocking became faster, harder, the knuckles of some unseen force pounding the window until the glass trembled. The tapping abruptly ceased, and just as I was about to ask Angie if I should go check, she screamed. A sound of shattering glass and a deafening crash followed. Whoever had been outside had pressed so fiercely against the window that the pane exploded. We raced up the stairs together, leaping over collapsed boards and rotted steps as if on pure instinct. I dared to glance back, but Angie yanked my face away before I could see. The sound of splintering glass echoed behind us as we reached the bathroom and bolted the door. In the hallway, a thin, anguished cry, like a baby calling out for its mother, bounced between closed doors and padded walls. Angie pressed her back against the door, wedging her feet against the bathtub, gripping a knife she'd grabbed from the kitchen. I followed suit, standing shoulder to shoulder. Slow, measured footsteps began ascending the stairs, calculated, casual. The crying had turned derisive, almost mocking, piercing outbursts and sudden high-pitched giggles that started and stopped abruptly. We heard a resounding crash as the first door on the upper floor was kicked in, my bedroom, and then another sound from Mama's room. The next door along the hall, followed by the bathroom. They were looking for us. "What the hell is going on?" I managed to ask Angie, tears streaming down my face, unstoppable. I saw her rise from the floor, steadying herself against the door, as we then heard the unmistakable sound of a second door being flung open. Mama's room. The bathroom lay just beyond. Angie pulled me forward, shoving me to the floor and handing me the knife. I shook my head, terrified at the thought of having to use it, and tried to return it to her. But Angie shoved me aside and pressed the knife into my hands. The pressure of her thumb on the blade was enough to draw blood. I saw my sister's blood trickle down her wrist. A twisted, red trail that, despite the pain, flowed steadily into my grasp. I took the knife. Something battered against the wall that separated Mama's room from the bathroom. A shrill, keening wail followed. I held my breath, feeling my heart pound wildly at the base of my throat. "I'm getting my phone from my room," I whispered urgently. I shook my head, wanting to protest. Angie covered my mouth with her hand. I could taste the salt and sweetness of her blood on my palm, like the remnants of a birthday cake eaten by the sea. "Yes, I'm getting the phone, and I'll call the police." "We'll be okay," she insisted. I shook my head again. "It's the only way. When I go, you have to bolt that door and don't open it for anyone. Not for me, not for anyone, promise me." I couldn't speak as Angie pressed her hand hard enough to force a promise, her grip crushing my teeth against my lips until tears welled up in my eyes. "Promise me, Em." Then something smashed the door of the adjacent room. Angie gently brushed the stray strands of hair from my face and tucked them behind my ear. "Promise," she murmured, as she slowly opened the door, the bolt creaking softly. I saw the curve of her shoulder fade away into the blackened hallway beyond, like the moon vanishing during an eclipse. And then she was gone. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and I bolted the latch just as something slammed against the door from the outside. A shrill scream erupted, and the door handle rattled violently, enough to loosen a screw. I could see something crawling toward me on the tiled floor, and then silence. I sat there, my back to the door, clutching the knife, wishing more than anything that I still had Angie's hand in mine. There was nothing but silence, only me, and my breath slowly filling the room. "Em?" came a voice from behind the door. I jumped, tightening my grip on the knife. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" "Ma, is that you?" My voice broke as I whispered, wrapping my arms around myself, trembling as I tried to remain calm. "Honey, it's okay. Just open the door. It's all right, let me in," the voice coaxed. "Let me in, everything's going to be okay." She rapped gently on the door again. "Just let me in, please. It's all okay." Her voice cracked with remorse as she began to weep, pleading, "I'm so sorry, baby, I'm so sorry." I squinted through my tears. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me, like back when I'd come home from the swings with a scraped knee. Maybe this time she meant it. Maybe everything would be okay. My hand moved back to the latch. Then Angie's warm, familiar voice came through the door. "Yes, Emily, come on in, it's all okay." My hand froze on the latch as I tightened my grip on the knife. Angie had never called me by my full name. A hand pounded at the door again. The handle slipped. "Emily, let's come in." Angie's voice deepened, turning hoarse, punctuated by those same shrill giggles from before. Now, Mama's voice spoke, begging and weeping, growing louder. "Let me in, let me in, let me in," she chanted over and over, interspersed with the sound of pounding fists on the door. I screamed, "That's not my sister, and you're not my mother." I cried out from behind the door, covering my head with my hands. I scrambled into the bathtub, curling into a ball, pressing the knife against my chest. I didn't know what was out there at the door, but I knew it wasn't Angie. It wasn't the voice that cheered when I changed the TV channel, that congratulated me on my birthday, that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, that read me stories about princesses who never woke up. It was inhuman. Soon, there were shouts and crashing sounds from outside, the pounding of footsteps and frantic running. A deep, guttural howl tore through the house, filling every corner until I felt as if I were drowning in sound. And then the door was forced open. I screamed, covering my eyes as I awaited the end. Strong arms lifted me from the bathtub and carried me out of the room. I caught a glimpse of the shattered door, its surface streaked with long scratches reaching down to the floor, and torn-up cushions scattered along the hallway as though soft snow had fallen inside. I watched as uniformed officers swept through every room that looked as if it had been ravaged by something wild. Outside, in our driveway, police cars and an ambulance were parked. Amid the flashing blue and red lights, Angie stood there, bathed in neon-like light that made her look almost angelic in the darkness. I broke free from a police officer's grasp and ran to her, clinging to both of us, broken pieces and all, beneath all the constellations we had once invented together. A soft, pained cry emanated from the ambulance as it rocked gently. Angie turned my head away with a sorrowful smile that made my chest ache as I finally understood. In the end, there was no demon, no wild animal or violent intruders trying to break in. It was just Mama, completely consumed by alcohol and drugs, drowning in everything in between after weeks of relentless binging. Something had finally shattered inside her, and this time, no matter how much we tried, we couldn't put her back together again. Sometimes you fall one last time and never get up. Angie had found her in the backyard, blood dripping from her mouth, with needle marks along her forearms like uncharted maps of desperate, rail-thin roads leading to one more shot, one more fix. After rummaging through the kitchen, throwing away what little Mama's alcohol left behind, Angie had left to search for the stash hidden in the bathroom. She didn't want me, just the drugs on the other side of the door, leaving her so high that she could almost perfectly mimic Angie's soothing voice. It turned out that the real monsters are the ones that slowly eat you alive. Those that come in bottles or syringes or manifest as the long list of reasons you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes, the monsters are the ones who teach you the hardest lessons or show you the deepest love. but it's up to you whether you let them in. When I was a kid, I loved playing in the woods around our small town of Oak Ridge, nestled on the edge of the vast Appalachian forest in eastern Tennessee. I was raised solely by my hardworking father, a man who did everything he could to provide for us. Most days, while he was off working long hours, I was left home alone. With only a few channels on cable TV that barely captured my interest, I spent nearly every afternoon exploring the outdoors. Our modest house had a tiny backyard, a small patch of mowed grass that quickly gave way to an untamed thicket. In Oak Ridge, the houses were close together and nearly every yard was fenced in, so we rarely saw our neighbors wandering freely in each other's backyards. Yet, nothing could keep me away from the wild, mysterious pull of the forest. I knew many secret spots among the towering pines and oaks. Day after day, I ventured further into the woods, drawn by the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the distant sounds of voices laughing or talking. Whenever I heard those unfamiliar voices, I'd freeze and scurry away, instinctively hiding until the sounds faded into silence. One crisp autumn afternoon, I set off deeper into the forest, determined to find a new adventure. I stumbled upon a small clearing, encircled by dense trees that almost formed a natural barrier. The place struck me as perfect for building a makeshift shelter, a secret hideout fashioned entirely from the resources nature provided. I recalled a survival show I'd once seen on TV, which had sparked my imagination for bushcraft skills. After planning my little fort, I hurried home and retrieved some of my father's tools from the garage, including a trusty hatchet. With my impromptu toolkit in hand, I returned to the clearing as the late afternoon sun began its descent, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Glancing at my wristwatch, I noted it was already 5:30 p.m. I hesitated for a moment, worried the darkness might set in before I could get very far with my project, but resolved to work a little bit before heading back. When I finally arrived at the clearing, I looked up and froze. There, standing silently in the middle of the clearing, was a man. He wore a plaid shirt paired with worn jeans and a faded camouflage cap, and he had a black bandana wrapped around his mouth. His eyes were wide and unmoving, as if he had been caught in the act of something he knew he shouldn't be doing. In his hand, he gripped a shovel, and I noticed he had already been digging at the very spot where I had planned to build my shelter. But that wasn't all. Just a few yards behind him lay the still, lifeless body of a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s. Her head was tilted unnaturally to one side, her vacant eyes seemingly fixed on me, as if staring into an endless void. The man took a cautious step forward and, in a low, measured tone, said, "Hey, kid, let's not do anything rash. I'm not gonna hurt you." Yet, as he slowly advanced, fear surged through me. Clutching my hatchet tightly, I raised it above my head and hurled it at him in a desperate bid for safety. Even though my throw went wildly over his head, he ducked quickly, and I swear I saw a flash of anger flicker in his eyes. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I spun around and ran as fast as I could back home, the pounding of my feet on the dry, leaf-strewn forest floor echoing behind me. I could hear him chasing after me for a moment, the sound of his hurried steps mixing with a sudden, loud thud, like a heavy object crashing to the ground. Glancing back for just an instant, I saw him stumble and fall, and that moment spurred me on even faster. Bursting through the back door of our house, I slammed it shut and dashed into the kitchen, snatched up the phone, and dialed 911. Within minutes, the dispatcher assured me that the police were on their way. Trembling, I grabbed a kitchen knife and positioned myself in front of our living room sofa, its back facing the sliding glass door, and waited. I scanned every shadow, expecting to see the man creeping back, but he never reappeared. Soon enough, the police arrived, along with my father, who had been notified from work. Overwhelmed by tears, I recounted everything that had happened. The officers combed through the forest in search of the man, but they never found him. They did, however, recover the body of the young woman. Later, it emerged that she was a hitchhiker, a young woman who had been traveling and, tragically, had met her fate when this man had taken her in and then assaulted her. In a desperate attempt to cover his tracks, he had tried to erase the evidence I had unwittingly stumbled upon. After the entire ordeal, my father and I left Oak Ridge and moved to a nearby town. Though I still love the great outdoors and the beauty of the forest, I never dare venture into it alone. The thought still haunts me. What if he had buried her before I arrived? What if my secret shelter had been built right over her grave? That chilling memory is a part of me now, a reminder of the dark secrets hidden even in the places that seem most familiar and safe. My father works for the United States Geological Survey, essentially the American counterpart to NASA, except that instead of watching over air and space, they monitor the Earth. When I was 5 years old, Dad once told me that he was the man who figured out who poisoned the well, which isn't far from the truth. Back when we lived out west, his job often took him to national parks and wildlife reserves to collect water and soil samples. As he rose quickly through the ranks, our family moved from place to place so he could remain close to his superiors. I never minded, and even today I find it strange when my friends say they've lived in the same house their whole lives. We usually stayed only about 3 years before moving on. It almost sounds as if my father were a hitman, but I promise you he wasn't. The point is, new houses meant new rooms. I love my current bedroom in my Denver apartment. A quiet space where I can watch movies, sketch, work on projects, call my friends, or simply unwind after a long day at school. I can decorate it however I want and truly make it my own. As a child, I never had that freedom. I shared a room ever since my older sister Emily was born. With 6 of us under one roof, no one ever really had their own room. We got what was essentially a dormitory-style space with an assigned bunkmate, usually Emily, the second oldest. I know I'm not the only one who felt unsettled by that arrangement. Let me start with our first home in the Rocky Mountains, a tiny condominium nestled among the peaks, and the first place I can remember clearly. We moved there sometime around 2007 or 2008, because I celebrated my 3rd birthday in that cramped kitchen while Mom was pregnant with my first little brother. The house sat in a peculiar spot. Off a bend on what was essentially the highway, a gravel road led to 3 one-story tan duplexes. We had the one at the very end of the curve, with a big front yard and plenty of room to run around. Even now, it strikes me as the strangest house we ever lived in. Perhaps it's just that my childhood memories feel more like vivid dreams than real recollections. But I remember that house with an intensity that begs for another telling. What I want to focus on, however, is our bedroom. By day, it was a calm place reserved for sleep, since we spent most of our time outdoors or playing in the living room. But at night, in an area free from much light pollution, it transformed into a pitch-black void. I'll try to use as colorful language as possible, because those memories are as vivid as they are unsettling. A flashback almost too surreal to believe. My 2 younger brothers, Danny and Chris, were born while we lived in that house, and the sound of their cries at night was naturally jarring, though Emily and I mostly tuned them out. I'd hear those cries in my sleep, and dream of wandering through shadowy woods searching for my brothers. When I woke, my heart would pound so hard that I'd sit up on my top bunk, trying to steady myself before climbing down to check on Mom in the crib, just to make sure the baby was still there. By the time we moved again, I was in 2nd grade, and my parents had found a larger home in a small town near Atlanta. We lived there for nearly 5 years. The house boasted a rear addition where the master bedroom was located, but Emily and I continued to sleep in the original master suite. It was during this time that our two youngest sisters, Grace and Mary, were born, completing our brood of 6. As usual, the babies slept in a room on the opposite side of the house, which made it harder to tell if one was restless late at night. Still, on several occasions I awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. I didn't think much of it at the time. My imagination was always running wild, but only the next morning did I realize the footsteps were deliberate, measured steps, much like the quiet tread of a child sneaking around on Christmas morning. One morning at breakfast, Mom asked if I was feeling sick. I was confused and said no. She explained that Emily had come to her insisting that I'd been sneaking off to the bathroom every night. In retrospect, and without any history of sleepwalking, I still have no idea how that could have been possible. In fact, Emily recently told me that she never saw me move, only heard the soft patter of footsteps in the hallway. I tried to explain that I thought it was her moving around at night, but she fell silent and insisted she didn't want to discuss it any further. Fast forward to our next home near Houston. Over the next couple of years, I changed bedrooms several times. The two youngest girls had grown old enough to move into what was dubbed the big kids' room, and the two eldest, Emily and I, were reassigned. The room I initially occupied was right next to the master bedroom, and I shared it with Grace. Grace was a fine roommate. I was 12 and she was 4, so whenever she had nightmares, she'd crawl into my bed. Sometimes, if I happened to be awake while she did, she'd confide in me about what had disturbed her. One chilly February night, about a month after we moved in, she whispered that a lady had been standing at the door, watching her. She scares me, and she won't go away. Hey, kid, now she scares me too, I thought. Reluctantly, I pulled Grace close between myself and the wall, turned my back to the door, and stayed with her until she finally drifted back to sleep. This routine went on, erratically at times, for several months, until Grace decided that the basement room, which Emily and Mary shared, was a better place to sleep, especially during the sweltering summer months when the heat lingered long after sunset. So Emily and I swapped rooms. Mary took the top bunk above me, while Grace moved to the basement with Emily. The first few nights passed without incident, until one night I distinctly heard my little sister's voice calling out in the dark. Hello. Oh no. I got up, carefully balanced on the edge of my bed to pull Mary into mine. I remember that incident all too well, probably because it happened relatively recently, in 2017. It still perplexes me that Mary didn't speak to the door, but instead to the dresser by the window. Our next move was to a small house in a Midwestern town in North Carolina, the smallest home relative to our family size. By then, I was in 9th grade and had long dreamed of having my own room. Instead, I was squeezed into the master bedroom with 3 sisters. My parents occupied a room on the other side of the house, as did my brothers. Although the master bedroom was spacious, it quickly became crowded with 4 girls ranging in age from 5 to 15. With 2 bunk beds filling the space, the room resembled either a military barracks or a very girlish spaceship. I'm glad to say that nothing unusual happened in the first year. In 10th grade, Mom moved the boys to the 3rd floor. A large, carpeted space we turned into a playroom. Mary and Grace were shifted to the old boys' room, leaving Emily and me to share the master bedroom again. And again, we slept there for several months without any incidents. Before I continue, let me make one thing clear. I don't sleepwalk, talk in my sleep, or really move much when I'm asleep. So, when I woke up one night at an unexplainably eerie hour, the only logical reason for my eyes to be open would have been that I was about to be sick. I didn't feel ill, so I tried to roll over and go back to sleep. But I couldn't move. I could move my eyes, but I lay on my back with my arms tucked under the blankets, utterly paralyzed. There was something, or someone, in the room next to where Emily slept. I could feel its presence hovering over me, much like when you close your eyes and sense a friend lightly tapping you. The feeling of a presence next to me was so strong that it made it nearly impossible to shift or even kick. Something pressed against the side of my bed so forcefully that I swear if I'd seen my mattress from the elbow, it would have sagged under the weight. Then, without my consent, I began to move, not by my own action, but as if the mattress itself were rocking me deliberately. I tried once more to lift my arms, but they stubbornly remained unmoving. The presence was still there, and if anything, it had grown stronger, looming over me like a cartoonish rain cloud. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. This had never happened before, and a deep, primal fear crept into my mind. Still, I told myself I was merely dreaming. After about 10 minutes of continuous, deliberate rocking, I managed to clear my throat. "Hey, I'm okay now." It wasn't the grandest thing to say, but it was all that came to mind. My voice startled me, so soft and strangely detached, like the murmur of someone speaking in a half-dream. Almost immediately, the rocking ceased. I lay still for a moment before testing my arms again. Slowly, I sat up and scanned the room. There was nothing there, exactly as I expected, yet my attention was drawn to the doorway. Although nothing was visible, it felt as though something lingered there. With my knees drawn to my chest, I managed to whisper, "Thank you. Good night." I wish I could say I had a cooler line ready, but that was all I could muster. Our current house, built in the 1980s and still occupied by the original owners just down the street, is relatively tame. Technically, I have my own room now, a space roughly half the size of a typical college dorm, separated from the adjacent master bedroom by a temporary wall. When I first saw the photos online, I assumed it was meant to be an office. I didn't need much space anyway, and I was planning to move out in 2 years. But on the very first day I stepped inside to drop off my boxes, I opened the door and was hit by an absurd surge of fear. I just stood in the doorway for a moment, then threw my box in and sprinted right back outside. By the time I returned reluctantly to help set up the kitchen, that overwhelming feeling had vanished. While packing for my first year of college, I heard it again. The same disembodied cries from my days in that mountain home in the Rockies. Whereas before, I'd heard them in a hazy dream, now I was wide awake in my room. Clutching boxes of clothes, I paused to listen for any more sounds. Nothing. I pinched my arm, waited another moment, and continued packing. But what does it all mean? If it takes me so long to share these stories with you, I must have some inkling of what was happening in the very rooms where I was supposed to feel safest. I could dismiss these strange encounters as the product of an overactive imagination, but I'd rather consider something a bit more plausible, depending on your own views about the supernatural or the existence of ghosts. As I wrote, I not only called my sister, but also the neighbors who had built the house. Though they were long past the age of raising children, they remembered that the room I now occupied had once served as a storage space for old baby clothes, cribs, and children's beds. I began to wonder. Every room in which I've ever slept, whether adjacent to or originally part of the master suite, might once have been used as a children's room. If I line up all the encounters I've had, restless infants crying, tiny footsteps, bleeding female apparitions, they all seem to point to one theme: childcare. Bear with me. The one episode I couldn't quite place for a long time was the sleep paralysis incident. What exactly happened? My arms were pinned to my sides, I couldn't move, and something caused me to be rocked from side to side, almost as if I were being cradled, being gently rocked while someone watched over me from the edge of a cradle. I'm not saying I wasn't raised properly, but in a large family, the responsibility of looking after a younger child, or even 5 other siblings, naturally falls on the eldest. I changed all my siblings' diapers, much to their chagrin, and cared for them almost as attentively as my own mother did. I don't complain. I love my brothers and sisters. Perhaps I simply attract the spirits or memories of other caregivers and children, because that is who I am. And maybe if or when I become a ghost, I'll do the same. Welcome those who visit, not with malice or ill intent, but simply to check on the ones I love, long after they've left the room.